My name is Callahan Reeve. I am 29 years old, and I want to tell you, Denise, about the Tuesday evening at 7:12 when you set your glass of Merlot on the placemat my mother hand-stitched, looked at me across a table of food I had cooked, and said, "Give your brother your room, or pack your bags and go." You said it the way someone requests extra napkins, like it was logistical, like my bedroom, the one with the water stain on the ceiling from the winter my mother and I carried buckets up 2 flights of stairs because we couldn't afford the plumber, was a scheduling conflict you'd resolved in your head before you opened your mouth. I set my fork down. The lamb I'd seasoned with rosemary and garlic sat untouched on the blue ceramic plate my mother bought at a craft fair in Astoria the summer I turned 9. Across from me, your son Derek, 17, broad-shouldered, wearing a $200 hoodie I'd watched you charge to my credit card 3 weeks prior, sat with his elbows on the table, scrolling his phone, not even looking up. Like the outcome was administrative, like I was a tenant receiving a notice, and beside my plate sat the grocery receipt, $47.60, still curled from the printer, still warm from my pocket, where I'd shoved it 2 hours earlier, while hauling bags from the car alone, because no one in this household offered to help carry what I'd paid for. I looked at that receipt. I looked at your hand wrapped around the wine glass. I looked at the way Derek's thumb moved across his screen, without a single flicker of discomfort, and something in me went perfectly still. Not angry, not hurt, still. My hands flattened on the table. My breathing dropped into my chest, the way it does on a job site when I'm looking at something that shouldn't be there. A stain pattern behind drywall, a deflection in a beam that means the load path has been compromised for years. I was already counting. The mortgage payments, the tax installments, the insurance premiums, the furnace, the roof, 2 years of numbers, scrolling behind my eyes like a spreadsheet populating itself without my permission. $47.60 for tonight's dinner, $34,200 total since my father died. I held those numbers in my body like a weight I'd been carrying in both hands without realizing I could set it down. "Understood," I said. One word. Flat. You heard compliance, Denise. What you couldn't hear was the decision that had already formed in the stillness between my second and third breath. But this isn't really for you. Not anymore. You'll hear this eventually, or you won't. What I'm here to do is talk to the people watching. Before I tell you what I found when I started looking, what time is it where you are? I want to know how many people heard something they recognized in that opening. Because I think some of you have been sitting at that table. I think some of you have paid for the meal and been told to leave the house, and I think some of you are still sitting there right now, calling it love, calling it family, calling it anything other than what it actually is. Let me tell you what I do for a living, because it matters more than you'd think. I'm a building envelope consultant. That means I inspect the invisible systems that separate the inside of a structure from the outside. Vapor barriers, flashing details, sealant joints, waterproofing membranes. I spend my professional life finding where protective layers have failed in buildings that look perfectly solid from the curb. I use thermal imaging cameras, moisture meters, borescopes threaded through half-inch holes in walls. I read structures the way a cardiologist reads an EKG, not by what's visible, but by what the patterns underneath reveal about systemic failure happening where no one is looking. I can stand in a parking lot and tell you which corner of a building is retaining water behind its cladding based on the discoloration pattern of the mortar joints. I can look at a ceiling stain and tell you whether it's been there 3 weeks or 3 years, based on the mineral deposit ring at its edge. I notice what's wrong in systems designed to look right. That skill had protected commercial properties from catastrophic moisture damage for 6 years across the Pacific Northwest. It was about to dismantle the architecture of my own family from the foundation up. The night Denise issued her ultimatum, I drove 17 minutes to a motor lodge off Route 26, room 114. The bedspread was a faded burgundy with gold diamonds. The carpet smelled like the cleaning solution they use in hospital corridors, something between pine and ammonia. I sat on the edge of the mattress with my 2 duffel bags on the floor and my work laptop open on the particle board desk, and I felt the specific silence of a person who has just walked out of a structure they spent years maintaining for someone else's comfort. I opened my financial tracking spreadsheet. I'd started keeping it 18 months earlier, not out of suspicion, but because tracking expenditures through systems is what I do. It's professional reflex. Column A, date. Column B, expense category. Column C, dollar amount. Column D, beneficiary. The total at the bottom of column C read $34,200. That was what I'd personally spent maintaining my parents' house since my father's death 26 months ago. Mortgage shortfalls Denise never covered. Property taxes she didn't know the amount of. The emergency furnace replacement in December, $4,800, that she'd acknowledged with a nod and the words, "Good. It was freezing in here." The roof patch in March, $16,200, that she'd never mentioned again. Groceries every single week. Her Merlot. Derek's protein powder. The lamb. My father married Denise when I was 22. He was 54, recently retired from 31 years with the Postal Service, collecting a modest pension, and lonely in a way that made him vulnerable to a specific kind of attention. I recognized it at the time. I said nothing because his grief was his, and I thought he deserved whatever comfort he could find after watching my mother die of ovarian cancer at 51. Denise was 41, divorced, with a 12-year-old son and a warmth that functioned like a space heater. Immediate, targeted, and effective only within a narrow radius. She moved into our family home, the 3-bedroom Craftsman bungalow on Alder Street that my parents bought together in 1998 for $189,000, with a conventional 30-year mortgage my mother's nursing salary helped qualify. And within 4 months, every photograph of my mother had been relocated from the living room walls to a cardboard box in the garage labeled storage, in Denise's handwriting. I found that box 6 weeks after the move. I stood in the garage holding a framed photograph of my mother at my 8th grade graduation, her hand on my shoulder, her face turned toward me instead of the camera, and I felt something in my chest that I chose to call acceptance. My father had moved on. The house was adapting. I would adapt with it. When my father was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 14 months into the marriage, I moved back home immediately. I took a remote-heavy project load at work and restructured my inspection schedule around his chemotherapy appointments. I drove him to Osu 3 times a week in my own car. I sat with him during infusions. I learned to prepare the specific bland meals his oncologist recommended: steamed rice, clear broth, plain crackers, and brought them to his bedside on a tray my mother had kept in the kitchen cabinet beside the stove for 20 years. Denise handled his diagnosis by repainting the living room a shade called Coastal Fog and purchasing a new sectional sofa that she charged to a credit card I later learned was secured against the house's equity. My father died on a Wednesday in April, 56 years old. His hand was dry and light in mine. The morphine drip had taken him somewhere I couldn't follow, but I held his hand anyway because it was the last physical thing I could do for the man who taught me to read a level, who drove me to my first job interview, who called me every Sunday morning for 4 years of college without missing one. Downstairs, the television was playing at a volume I could hear through the floorboards, some renovation show, sledgehammers into drywall. Denise didn't come upstairs until the hospice nurse, a woman named Gloria Vasquez, whose calm hands and meticulous documentation I would later have reason to be deeply grateful for, went down and told her it was time. The irony sits with me still. I spent every working day identifying where protective barriers had failed, where water was entering structures through gaps nobody maintained, where entire wall assemblies were rotting from the inside because someone installed a flashing backwards or skipped a sealant joint to save 40 minutes of labor. I wrote reports documenting systemic failure in buildings other people assumed were sound, and the entire time, I was living inside a household where my financial boundaries had been breached so gradually and so completely that I couldn't see the damage because I was standing inside it. I was the structure, and I'd stopped inspecting myself. After the funeral, Denise sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where she would later tell me to leave, and said, "I think it makes sense for you to stay. You know the house. You know how things work around here. We can be a family." I heard an invitation. What she meant was, "You can continue paying." I know that now. I didn't know it then. Or I chose not to, which amounts to the same failure. For 26 months, I covered everything. The mortgage, $1,340 per month, auto-drafted from my checking account. Property taxes, $4,100 annually, paid in 2 installments from my savings. Homeowners insurance, $1,800 per year. Utilities averaging $340 per month. Groceries averaging $600 per month. For 3 adults, only one of whom was ever thanked for any of it, and only when Denise needed me to pick up something specific on my way home from a site inspection. I paid, because the house still smelled like my father's coffee in the morning. I paid, because my mother's rose garden, what was left of it, 3 bushes Denise hadn't yet removed, still bloomed along the front walkway every June. I paid because I told myself that maintaining the structure meant maintaining the memory. It didn't. It meant funding someone else's occupation of my own inheritance. The first piece of evidence was the one everyone at that dinner table already knew. I was paying for everything while being told I didn't belong. That's layer 1. The obvious insult, the surface cruelty that any stranger watching would recognize. But surface damage is rarely the full story. In my profession, a water stain on a ceiling means I need to open the wall. What's visible is an invitation to investigate what's hidden. 3 days after that dinner, sitting in a motel room with the heater rattling against the baseboard, I logged into the county assessor's online portal and pulled the property records for 42117 Alder Street. My father's name, Martin Reeve, sole owner on the deed. No transfer recorded. No joint tenancy filing, no beneficiary deed. The house remained in his estate, which meant that under Oregon's intestate succession statutes, ownership passed jointly to his surviving spouse and his surviving biological descendants. Denise and I each held legal interest. She did not own this house outright. She had never owned this house outright. She had been issuing ultimatums inside a structure she co-owned with the person she was trying to evict. Then I found something else, and this is where my hands went still for the second time. I requested a copy of the homeowner's insurance policy through the online portal, standard procedure in any property investigation I conduct professionally. The policy had been updated 9 months prior. The named insured had been changed from Estate of Martin Reeve to Denise M. Caldwell, individually. I stared at that screen, the way I stare at a thermal image showing a moisture plume behind intact stucco. The surface looks fine, but the data is showing me catastrophic failure behind it. The policy change required authorization, either a deed transfer, which hadn't occurred, or a signed authorization from all parties with ownership interest. I had signed nothing. I called the insurance carrier's documentation department, identified myself as a co-owner of the property, cited the deed and probate records, and requested the authorization form that enabled the policy change. It arrived in my email within 48 hours. The signature on the form was my father's, Martin A. Reeve, dated October 14th, 7 months after his death. I am not a forensic document examiner, but I have reviewed thousands of contractor sign-offs, code compliance forms, and inspection certificates across 6 years of professional practice. I know what a signature looks like when it's been reproduced rather than produced. The pen pressure is uniformly medium, where a natural signature shows variation between heavy initial strokes and lighter connective movements. The stroke terminals are blunt, stopped rather than tapered. And my father's signature had a specific characteristic I'd watched him produce since I was old enough to sit on his lap while he signed birthday cards. An upward hook on the final F of Reeve that lifted off the page at approximately 30 degrees. The signature on this form had no hook. The terminal stroke was flat, horizontal, dead. It was a photocopy of his handwriting, traced or digitally reproduced, not the product of his living hand. Denise had forged my dead father's signature to seize sole insurance coverage on a property she did not solely own. That was layer 2. Not a spontaneous cruelty, a premeditated fraud. Planned, executed, documented on a form she believed no one would ever request. Layer 3 took me to the county recorder's office in person. I requested the full title history and encumbrance record for 42117 Alder Street. What came back in the stack of printed documents was a lien I'd never seen. A home equity line of credit opened 11 months before my father died. During his treatment, while I was driving him to chemotherapy and sleeping on a cot beside his hospital bed. The HELOC was for $60,000, secured against the home's equity. Borrower, Martin A. Reeve. Co-signer, Denise M. Caldwell. I obtained disbursement records through a formal written request to the lending institution, citing my ownership interest and providing the probate case number. The $60,000 had been drawn in 3 installments of $20,000 each over a 4-month period. Deposited into an account at Pacific Northwest Credit Union. Account holder, Denise M. Caldwell, solely. She had leveraged my parents' home, the house my mother's income helped purchase, the house where I learned to walk, where my father taught me to use a tape measure, where my mother grew roses along the front path for 22 years, to extract $60,000 into a personal account while my father was dying in an upstairs bedroom, while I was downstairs making his meals, while Gloria was documenting his Glasgow coma scale scores and noting that he could not, by the end, lift his own hand. Denise, I want to make sure you understand what I found next, because the 4th layer is the one you built everything on top of. The one you thought no one would ever reach because they'd have to dig through 3 layers of fraud to get there. I retained an estate litigation attorney named Priya Okafor. 12 years of practice, former clerk for the Oregon Court of Appeals, the kind of woman who reads a document once and identifies the structural failure on the same pass. Priya subpoenaed the credit union statements for Denise's account. The $60,000 had been drawn down to $3,400 over 14 months. The disbursements told a story. $22,000 for a vehicle purchase, Derek's Jeep Wrangler, titled in Denise's name. $11,400 in personal credit card payments. $14,600 transferred to a savings account labeled D. Caldwell, Education Fund, Derek's future, not mine. A $3,100 vacation package to Cabo San Lucas, booked for a week that overlapped precisely with my father's final hospitalization. I was holding his hand. She was boarding a plane. And the HELOC documents, the ones supposedly signed by my father when he was conscious and competent, bore a date that Gloria Vasquez's independent patient logs showed was impossible. On that date, my father's Glasgow coma scale score was 6. He was on continuous morphine. He was not conscious. He could not have held a pen. He could not have understood a document. He could not have consented to anything. Denise hadn't just told me to vacate my bedroom. She had stolen my father's equity while he was dying, forged his signature after he was dead, restructured the property's insurance to exclude me, and funded her son's life with money extracted from a house my mother helped build. The dinner table ultimatum wasn't cruelty. It was the final move in a longer strategy. Get the remaining co-owner out. Eliminate any challenge to sole control, and continue extracting from a dead man's estate indefinitely. The confrontation happened on a Saturday morning in the house on Alder Street. My house. I arrived at 9:15 with Priya and a process server. The front door was the same sage green my mother had painted it in 2003. 3 of her rose bushes were gone, pulled out and replaced with ornamental grasses that required no maintenance and bore no memory. I knocked. Denise opened the door in a gray bathrobe, holding a coffee mug I recognized immediately. White ceramic, green rim, a chip on the handle from when I dropped it at age 11, and cried because I thought my mother would be angry. She wasn't, she'd said. Now it has a story. What are you doing here? Denise said. Not alarmed, annoyed, inconvenienced, as though I were a delivery arriving at the wrong time. Priya handed her the partition filing, then the civil fraud complaint, then the forged insurance authorization, with a metadata analysis report showing the PDF had been created on a device registered to Denise's personal email using a word processing application at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday 7 months after my father's last breath. Denise looked at the papers, set the coffee mug, my mother's mug, on the hallway table, crossed her arms. That's not what happened. Your father asked me to handle the insurance while he was still able to make decisions. He wanted me protected. Priya said nothing. I said nothing. The document said everything. You've always resented me, Denise continued, her voice climbing half a register. From the day your father brought me into this home, you never accepted that he moved on. You never accepted that someone else could matter to him. I stood in the hallway of my own house and watched her, still, counting her tactics the way I count moisture readings on a grid survey. After everything I've done, holding this household together, raising Derek in a stable home, keeping your father's spirits up during the worst year of his life, this is how you repay me. 3 tactics: denial, reframing me as the aggressor, loyalty appeal citing sacrifices I never witnessed, all delivered in under a minute. All performative, all structural, not emotional. She wasn't feeling these things. She was deploying them. Derek appeared on the staircase, shirtless, half awake, confused, and behind him, stepping through the kitchen doorway, someone Denise did not expect and could not have prepared for. Gloria Vasquez, the hospice nurse, subpoenaed by Priya 3 weeks prior. Gloria, who had maintained her own independent patient care logs every single day of my father's final 6 weeks, not because she suspected fraud, but because meticulous documentation was her professional standard. Gloria, whose logs recorded my father's consciousness level, medication dosages, visitor presence, and communication capacity for every shift she worked in this house. Gloria stood in the hallway, holding a manila folder, and said, quietly and clearly, Martin was not conscious the week those documents were dated. His Glasgow score was 6. I documented it every 4 hours. He could not have signed anything. Denise's hand moved toward the hallway table, reaching, I think, for my mother's mug. Something to hold, something to ground her in a room that was no longer hers. I spoke one sentence. I delivered it to her directly. The way you state a finding in an inspection report, no emotion, no emphasis, just the observation and its structural implication. You didn't inherit a family, Denise. You annexed a funding source and called it love. Silence. The house settled around us the way buildings do. Small creaks in the joists, the furnace cycling on, the refrigerator humming. Sounds I'd known my entire life. Sounds she'd lived inside for 5 years without ever once paying to maintain. The legal process unfolded across 3 months with the mechanical precision of institutional consequence. The civil court froze Denise's credit union account pending fraud investigation. The insurance carrier voided the policy change and reinstated the estate as named insured. The HELOC lender opened an internal review into the origination documents, specifically the borrower's signature, and the question of whether the co-signer had facilitated a fraudulent application. Denise's attorney, a legal aid referral who looked increasingly uncomfortable at each filing, advised her to settle. She agreed to relinquish all claim to the property, accept responsibility for the HELOC balance, and vacate within 45 days. The house sold in 5 weeks for $515,000. After closing costs, HELOC repayment, and Priya's fees, my net share was $267,000. Denise's remaining proceeds, diminished by the debt she'd created, were $41,000, enough for a security deposit and a few months' rent on a 2-bedroom apartment in Outer Beaverton. Not enough for the life she'd built on my father's name and my silence. Derek lost the Jeep within 6 weeks. Denise couldn't maintain the payments without my credit card funding the household. His education fund was identified as proceeds of fraud and frozen pending the civil resolution. He enrolled in community college the following January, working 30 hours a week at a restaurant to cover tuition. I don't know if this made him a better person. I know it made him a person who understood that money comes from somewhere, and that somewhere has a name and a limit. There was a secondary character in this, someone whose arc I need to tell honestly. My father's younger brother, Uncle Neil, 61 years old, retired electrician, present at every family gathering for 5 years, present at the dinner where Denise told me to leave, silent at that dinner, silent afterward. He'd watched Denise reorganize the household around herself for years. He'd noticed the photographs disappearing. He'd mentioned to me once, at a barbecue the summer after my father died, that Denise sure had settled in fast, then changed the subject when I looked at him too directly. After the partition filing became a matter of family knowledge, Neil called me. Hesitant. Halting. He said he'd seen things he should have spoken about. He said he'd watched Denise pressure my father into financial decisions during his treatment, and felt uncomfortable, but didn't want to interfere in Martin's marriage. He said he'd found it strange when Denise purchased Derek's Jeep in cash. He'd even asked my father about it, and my father had looked confused, said he didn't know what Neil was talking about. That was 8 months before my father died. Neil had witnessed confusion that was likely evidence of a dying man not knowing what was being done in his name, and he'd filed it away under "not my business." After the house sold, Neil came to see me at my new place. He stood in my kitchen and said, "I'm sorry I didn't say something sooner. I think I was afraid of being wrong." I looked at him for a long time. I said, "Thank you for telling me now. I did not say it was okay. It wasn't. It isn't." But his apology was real, and reality, even uncomfortable reality, is something I've learned to respect more than comfort. I used $52,000 of my settlement as a down payment on a small craftsman bungalow in Hillsborough. 2 bedrooms, a covered front porch, a yard with southern exposure and good drainage. The previous owners had let the landscaping go wild. Blackberry brambles had overtaken the fence line. The beds were compacted clay under 2 inches of bark dust. I spent my first 3 weekends stripping it back to bare earth. Then I went to a nursery in Tigard and bought 3 David Austin rose bushes, Gentle Hermione, Lady of Shalott, and Jude the Obscure. The same varieties my mother grew along the front path of the house on Alder Street for 22 years. The ones Denise pulled out in her second month there and replaced with boxwood hedges she'd seen in a magazine. I planted them in May. It's July now. They're blooming, apricot and cream and soft gold, clustered along my front walkway where the afternoon sun hits the pavers. Some mornings, I take my coffee out to the porch and just look at them. Not because they're extraordinary, because I postponed this for 7 years, believing that tending my mother's garden meant tending it in my mother's specific soil, in my mother's specific house. It didn't. It meant remembering what she grew and choosing to grow it again, somewhere I am not asked to justify my presence. Denise, there's one thing I never said to you directly. I promised at the beginning I would say it at the end. Here it is. I would have shared that house with you willingly, for the rest of my life, if you had once, even once, treated it as something we held together, rather than something you were taking from me. You didn't lose a house, you lost a person who was willing to carry you, and you lost her because you looked at her carrying and called it weakness, and weakness was something you thought you had the right to exploit. You were wrong. This morning, I sat at my kitchen table, a small oak table I bought at an estate sale for $60, solid, nicked, real, and I wrote a check for my quarterly property tax, $2,100, my house, my name, my signature, the one with the upward hook on the final E that I inherited from my father and will never let anyone reproduce. The check went into an envelope. The envelope went into my mailbox, and the receipt, $47.60 worth of nothing, the ghost of a grocery run for people who told me to leave, is no longer a number that means anything at all. It's just what lamb costs, and I can buy my own. I think about what silence does inside a system, not the silence of patience, not the silence of choosing your moment, but the silence of people who see structural failure and decide it isn't their wall to open. Uncle Neil saw the moisture stain. He noticed the discoloration. He even mentioned it once, casually, at a barbecue, the way a neighbor might point at your siding and say, "Huh, that looks a little off." Then he walked away. And the damage continued behind the surface for years, because noticing isn't the same as acting, and mentioning isn't the same as documenting, and discomfort isn't the same as intervention. Every system that protects an abuser does so through the silence of people who are close enough to see and comfortable enough to look away. I don't say that with anger. I say it as an observation, the same kind I write in inspection reports. The failure wasn't in one location. It was distributed across every point where someone could have spoken, and chose the easier path of assuming it was someone else's responsibility. Boundaries are not cruelty, even when they feel cruel to the person encountering them for the first time. A boundary is the minimum structural requirement for trust to remain possible. I didn't build a wall around myself to punish Denise. I identified where the barrier had failed, I documented the damage, and I installed a proper separation between my resources and someone else's unlimited demand. That's not revenge, that's remediation. And it's the only thing that keeps the structure standing. Is there someone in your life you've been describing in third person, to friends, to yourself, in your own head late at night? Because saying it to them directly would require you to believe it first. What would you say if you finally believed it? This story is a fictional narrative created for entertainment, education, and dramatic reflection. We hope it reminded you that your dignity is not negotiable, and that setting a boundary, even a painful one, can be an act of love for yourself and everyone the pattern would have reached next.